My name is Joe Doak, and I've recently retired as Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Development at the University of Reading. I'm currently doing a part-time doctoral study, mostly for fun. I'm currently in the final year, but it's been delayed due to COVID, and analysis is only just starting. This talk is based on this research. It is researching the development and redevelopment of Huntley Palmers factory on King's Road between 1800 and the year 2000. I'm looking through a property and planning lens into the development and redevelopment process. I'm exploring some linkages between the factory and the town, but this talk probably fails on the Trades Descriptions Act. The talk is organised in two parts. The first part provides a linear history of the Huntley Palmers factory on King's Road, whilst the second part applies a more non-linear approach by examining some of the explanatory components of how and why the factory developed as it did. Huntley Palmers started as a small bakery on London Street in 1822. After relocating to a new site on King's Road in 1846, it grew to become the largest biscuit factory in the world by 1900. The company eventually ended biscuit production on the King's Road site in 1976 and closed its head office function there in 1991. By the year 2000, it had been redeveloped into a mixed-use industrial, retail and office area. At its peak in the beginning of the 20th century, it covered 11 hectares, employed 5,500 people, and operated its own internal railway system consisting of 7.5 miles of track. This scale of biscuit production led the Daily Telegraph to dub Huntley Palmers as the seventh wonder of the commercial world. The Palmer family, who led the development and management of the factory, played a significant role in local politics and society. This slide provides a fly-through of the site in 2018 with a 1903 plan of the factory superimposed onto it. Starting from above the M4, it flies in to provide a site overview, shown in yellow, with the site of the original factory in the foreground, and swinging around to see the North factory on the north side of the River Kennet, then further north to note the internal railway system branching off the main Great Western Railway main line. Swinging south to look at the former social building for the Recreation Club, which is the only building remaining now, and then zooming in on the location of the original factory with a site planned for the Great Social Scheme next to the canal on the left, which we will talk about in a minute. So, what was the factory area like before Huntley Palmers moved there from their little shop in London Street? Well, it was mainly agricultural, dominated by Orts Farm, which was owned and leased by the Crown, who had owned it since the dissolution of Reading Abbey. A small area next to the jail, Blake's Wharf, was owned by Charles Newcomen, and it was leased, developed and occupied by John Jackson Blandy and his subtenants. Then in 1832 and 1833, Orts Farm was auctioned off by the Crown, with the astute assistance of Edward Driver, later to become a partner in Drivers Jonas, now part of Deloitte's. In this map of the auction lots, you can see King's Road running through the middle, Watlington Street on the left-hand side, London Road at the bottom of the plan, and Cemetery Junction, bottom right. In the second auction in 1833, John Whedon purchased lot 35 for £710, and also many other of the lots as well, whilst Thomas Lawrence bought lot 34. North of the river, John Blagrave purchased Lot 36. Between 1833 and 1846, Whedon and Lawrence went on to sell or lease various small parcels of those lots to builders, businesses and individuals, who then went on to build houses, factories, breweries, wharfs, pubs and warehouses on the land. This patchwork of land and buildings came to become a major challenge for Huntley and Palmer later on, when they sought to expand their factory. Enter George Palmer, stage left, wanting more space than London Street could provide for them. He manages to buy a recently constructed silk mill owned by John and James Bayliss, who went bankrupt. And they quickly expand, first on the island site and then north of the River Kennet, but not without difficulty. John Jackson Blandy refused to give up his lease for plot 14, Blake's Wharf, and the Palmers don't buy it until after he dies in 1867. Also, the owner of the Cannon Brewery, plot 18, holds out for a ransom price of £3,000. After 1867, Huntley and Palmers are engaged in land property purchases to the south of the factory, alongside the Kennet and Avon Canal, otherwise known as the New Cut. They were buying this land in preparation for their construction of the Great Social Scheme. After gaining control of the island site and then the land north of the River Kennet, Huntley and Palmers undertake a significant building programme. They start by building a new expanded factory on the island site called the South Factory in 1857. Once they get ownership of the land north of the River Kennet, they quickly built the North Factory in 1872, the Cake and Rusk Factory in 1873, and the Breakfast Factory in 1873. Later, they redeveloped part of the island site to create the H Factory in 1898. Finally, in 1905, they redeveloped the packing area of the factory to create the central warehouse. This go plan is dated 1903, so it doesn't show the central warehouse. In 1916, Huntley and Palmers also proposed to construct the Great Social Scheme on the land and property that they were purchasing to the south of the factory. This was due to contain recreation rooms, library, restaurants, gymnasium and a great hall at the western end which could accommodate 2,500 people. You might notice a gender division in the design of the scheme, something that the Palmer family instigated elsewhere in the factory, where there were separate entrances and start and end times for male and female workers. The official reason given for the non-implementation of the Great Social Scheme was that the Council Licensing Committee would not allow for the transfer of the licences of 3 pubs on the site to other pubs in the town. However, the increasing role of the state in social welfare provision and the economic difficulties of the company after World War I are also relevant. In 1921, Huntley and Palmers merged with Peak Freen, which was owned by the Carr family, to become Associated Biscuit Manufacturers, ABM. Rupert Carr took on the overall management of ABM, and he became increasingly influential, initiating periods of corporate restructuring and the establishment of a planning office for Huntley and Palmers, which was proposed in 1931 but only established in 1957. The interwar years were a period of modernisation of factory management and some investment in factory upgrade, which was strongly influenced by management consultants such as Erwick Orr. It led to new offices being designed and built, which reflected the new organisational ideas. A substitute for the Great Social Scheme was the conversion of some of the old offices to create a social building for the recreation club. Plenty of thought went into opening branch plants both overseas and in the north of England, but the only significant development was the establishment of a separate company in Paris in 1923. It wasn't until 1954 that another factory was built in Huyton, Liverpool. It incorporated some of the ideas for modern production that were difficult to implement at King's Road. The post-Second World War era was a period of corporate restructuring and the eventual closure of the Reading factory. When Jacobs Biscuits joined ABM in 1960, it wasn't too surprising that yet another consultancy report by Erwick Orr was commissioned, and Rupert Carr, who was still the group chairman, produced a programme for change, which began to be implemented from 1962. Stage 1 involved the demolition of the North Factory complex as part of a contraction of business at Reading, whilst Stage 2 led to the closure of production at King's Road in 1976. The subsequent redevelopment process involved extensive negotiations between Reading Council and planning consultants such as Hillier Parker and Barton Wilmore, who were working initially for ABM and then Nabisco, who bought out ABM in 1982. The main vehicles for this negotiation were the local plan, a planning brief for the site, and a subsequent set of planning applications. The land north of the River Kennet gained planning permission for industrial and retail warehousing and became the Forbury Retail and Industrial Park. Local residents and the Civic Society tried to save the 1937 office building and the former recreation club, but they were only successful in protecting the latter. The recreation club was bought by the Reading Borough Council and eventually converted to social housing in 1995. The area of the factory south of the River Kennet was redeveloped for offices for the Prudential Insurance Company in 1990. Moving on and considering the more non-linear explanatory components of the Huntley and Palmers story, we can identify a few actors and driving forces behind the development and redevelopment processes involved. First of all, we have the influence of the Palmer family. George Palmer led the whole project from the very start, and indeed Joseph Huntley and his sons had very little input into the development of the King's Road factory site. George Palmer was actively assisted by his brothers Samuel and William Isaac. William Isaac was especially active in land and property buying, where his calm and sociable character helped with some tricky land purchases north of the Kennet. Quaker ideas were evident in the business principles held by the first generation of the Palmer family. These focused on honesty, product quality, thrift and economy, and philanthropy. However, that didn't extend to their attitude to the wage rates for their employees or trade union recognition. Quakerism was also relevant for the family's business and social networks, often drawing on other Quaker businesses to fund, supply, and design the factory. In local philanthropy, the Palmer family were very active, providing sports and recreational facilities like Palmer Park and Kensington Road Sports Ground, a temperance hall and library, the London Road site for the university, and regular donations to many local organisations. The Great Social Scheme provides a good illustration of the philanthropic vision of the Palmer family, although it failed to materialise. After 1900, the second and third generation of the Palmer family concentrated more effort and money on their country estates, thereby reducing investment in the factory. The second significant explanatory component relates to the changing management structure of the firm and the resulting organisational cultures. After the initial partnership between Joseph Huntley and George Palmer, which really only lasted until the move to the King's Road factory, Huntley and Palmer became a paternalistic family partnership, which was formally established in 1857, which was controlled by George Palmer and his two brothers. After George's death in 1892, Huntley and Palmers became a limited liability company. This is when the second and then the third generations of the Palmer family took over control of the company. This led to a loosening of the Quaker principles and also a leaking of investment to the family country estates. In 1921, Huntley and Palmers amalgamated with Pink-Freen and later with Jacobs, becoming part of a national conglomerate. In this, the Reading factory became one of a number of locations in the company's portfolio. It was also during this time that new management ideas were implemented. After numerous management reviews in the post-World War II period, it led to the decision to close the factory and relocate production to Liverpool. Then in 1982, at the end of the factory's life, ABM became part of a multinational conglomerate when ABM was taken over by the US Nabisco Corporation, with biscuit manufacture just one small part of their global food empire. Another organisational aspect of Huntley and Palmer was its departmental structure, with departments often housed in separate buildings. This facilitated and constrained company operations and helped build a sense of identity and loyalty, but it also led to a lack of innovation and resistance to change. Here is an example of the significance of the departmental identity as expressed by Mrs. Midge Harris, one of the company's employees.
And I guess, if any, the chocolate department was considered to be the department to work in. Why? I never really found out, but I'm going to work in the chocolate factory. Well, if you've worked in a chocolate factory, you've really made the grade if you work in a chocolate factory. It had that kind of speciality, whether it was because of the products it manufactured, and I don't know, but I guess it could have been. But if you worked on ginger nuts, oh well, so what, that's ginger nuts, but the chocolate factory was the place.
From about 1920 onwards, individual departments were also the focus for the application of scientific management ideas, which were promoted by consultants who were hired to examine the organisation and development of the factory. Economic forces and imperatives were obviously important in the various periods of expansion, contraction and redevelopment. Obvious examples in Huntley and Palmer's case are the factory expansion and contraction in response to changes in output and the influence of constrained labour supply. But these were not the only economic and political components relevant to the Huntley and Palmers story. The British Empire had a significant role in helping to expand overseas trade and also in widening the source of raw materials. A whole system of rail and sea transportation, sales agents, marketing activities, and separate overseas departments were created to develop and maintain this. They were aided and abetted by the British Army and by government bureaucracy. Huntley and Palmers biscuit tins have been famously found in many parts of the world, illustrating this global system in a very physical and prosaic way. There were many management discussions in the company minutes about opening overseas factories during the interwar years, but only one separate company near Paris was established, and also for a relatively short period. Next on our list of explanatory components, we can note the important part played by state agencies in the development of the Huntley and Palmers factory. The release of Crown land in 1833 was obviously an important foundation for George Palmer's move to the King's Road area. From about 1880, Reading Corporation became a significant initiator of urban improvements in the local area, leading to increasing interactions with the company. This image is of the new factory bridge, which was built in 1938 as part of road improvements around the factory. The two World War periods involved significant central state intervention in the planning of the war economy. This impinged on the supply of raw materials, production outputs, building use, and even threatened the closure of the factory at one stage. One interesting aspect of World War II economic planning was the regional zoning of industry, squeezing the company's national market into a restricted regional one. Although there were some interactions over pre-World War II town planning activity, it was really the post-war period when the new planning system started to influence Huntley and Palmers, and particularly when ABM wanted to redevelop the site after 1976. We mustn't forget the local and national political role of members of the Palmer family in government, both as councillors and MPs, and in the wider social, institutional and business networks of Reading. Politically, the generations of the Palmer family tended to move from being liberal to conservative supporters, sometimes being actively anti-socialist, for example, during the early rise of the Labour Party in Reading. Despite the power held by the Palmer family, we shouldn't underestimate the influence of the workforce in shaping the factory. Company employees were often skilled and long-serving, and they were regularly called upon to fix the factory buildings and equipment by the thrifty Palmer family. Ironically, although saving money, they also delayed much-needed investment in new buildings and equipment. The engineering department had a substantial workforce with skilled engineers, metal workers, carpenters, bricklayers, all of whom knew the factory inside out. However, Huntley and Palmer was slow to recognise the emerging trade union movement, despite some evidence of increasing militancy when strikes took place in 1906 and 1916. Lorenzo Quelch, in his autobiography entitled An Old-Fashioned Socialist, spends some time reporting on the oppressive tactics against unionisation by Huntley and Palmers. After World War II, a workers' representative committee was set up, but the meeting agendas were limited to detailed complaints and issues. Union recognition was forced upon Huntley and Palmers after another strike in 1924, when 80% of the workforce walked out. Labour supply issues were regularly on the Huntley and Palmers agenda. Attempts were made to rent and build property to house factory staff, and recruitment campaigns were undertaken to bring in female labour, particularly from South Wales. In 1976, ABM formally stated that recruitment problems were a key reason for the closure of the factory. Finally, we also need to acknowledge the role of non-human components in the way the factory was developed and organised. There are a few dimensions to this, such as the handling of raw materials or the production requirements of the various biscuits and cakes, but I want to select the example of fire and the risks it presented in the factory. Fire was always a threat due to the use of the large ovens for baking and the potential self-combustion of flour particles. This risk was managed by a sophisticated system of water pipes, hydrants, sprinklers and alarms, and a 100-man fire brigade with uniforms, financial bonuses, training programs, medals and annual dinners. The Gold insurance maps capture the water infrastructure in great detail. The fire brigade was often called out to fight fires in Reading town, and they were seen to be as a better firefighting outfit than the less well-resourced Corporation Fire Brigade. Finally, I just want to mention a few key references that have helped me with my research. The definitive history of Huntley and Palmers, covering the history of the firm up until 1976, is Tony Corley's Huntley and Palmers of Reading, 1822 to 1972, Quaker Enterprise in Business. Tony undertook a lot of research into the businesses of Reading and the thoroughness and detail of the Huntley and Palmer history is indicative of his academic quality. Stephen Blake's PhD is a great source for the details of land and property development during the key period of Reading's growth, although he does exclude the Huntley and Palmer story in his thesis. Finally, I've been using ideas drawn from assemblage theory to help me understand and explain the processes covered in this video. The main archival sources for this talk have come from the collection held in the Museum of English Rural Life and the Berkshire Records Office, as well as the Reading Museum. Thank you for listening to my version of the Huntley and Palmer story.